You know, sometimes the biggest stories about fairness and power, well, they play out on the smallest of stages. Today, we're going to dive into the official court records of a homeowners association dispute. It's about a special election that got so heated, it actually ended up in front of a judge.
But first, let me ask you something. Imagine you show up to vote in your own community, right? A place you've lived for years. You think you've done everything by the book, but then you're told, nope, sorry, your vote doesn't count. What do you do? Well, that is the exact situation a group of homeowners found themselves in.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're at the High Lonesome Ranch Estates in rural Arizona. The date is July 5th, 2022, and the community is holding a special election where the scales of power are literally in the balance. And the stakes? They were incredibly high. Residents were voting on whether to recall several members of their own leadership board.
And that brings us right to the heart of the conflict. The disputed election itself.
This whole mess, this entire court case, really just boiled down to one number, 19. On the day of the election, 19 paper ballots from members of the community were collected, and then flat out rejected, left completely uncounted.
And you gotta remember, this wasn't just some routine vote. A recall election is a direct challenge to the people in charge. It's a formal process started by the homeowners themselves to kick out board members they're unhappy with. So every single one of those 19 votes was absolutely critical.
So how did the homeowners who cast those 19 ballots argue their case? What did they tell the court?
This quote right here, taken directly from their official petition, it just sums it up perfectly. They argued that even though they were physically there, in person, and totally eligible to vote, their right to do so was denied. And they were convinced that those uncounted votes were more than enough to swing the entire election. And this was the crucial point of confusion. On the left, you see the way things had always been done. For years, homeowners could just give their sealed ballots to a trusted courier on the election committee. Simple. But on election day, a brand new, unwritten rule was suddenly enforced. Now, only ballots mailed with an official U.S. postmark would be counted.
And man, this timeline from the court testimony just shows you how frustrating that day must have been. So they followed the old rules. Then they get to the meeting and find out their votes are invalid. They scramble to get new ballots to vote in person, but by the time they can, they're told the polls are closed. Just too late.
The justifications just kept shifting. First, the problem was the missing postmark. Then, when they tried to fix it by voting again in person, they were accused of double voting. And finally, the excuse was simply, it's too late.
Okay, so that's a really compelling case from the homeowners. But, you know, every story has two sides. So let's flip it and look at the HOA's defense.
The HOA's argument was all about strict procedure. Their lawyer basically said, look, there were only 3 official valid ways to vote in this election. You could do it online, you could mail your ballot in, or you could fill out a ballot right there in person at the meeting. That's it.
And this quote from the HOA's lawyers sums up their entire defense. From their point of view, it wasn't that the homeowners were denied the right to vote. It was that they just failed to use one of the approved methods before the 6 p.m. deadline.
So, to boil it all down, the HOA's defense was simple. Hand-delivering ballots was never a valid method, and the homeowners just missed their chance to correct the error and vote the proper way. In their view, it was a failure on the part of the voters, not the system. So with both sides presented, the case rested with an administrative law judge. It was time for a final, binding decision.
So you've got the homeowners saying they were unfairly disenfranchised by a sudden rule change, and you have the HOA saying, nope, they just failed to follow procedure. So where did the judge land on all this? Well, the judge's official findings of fact just blew the case wide open. First, she confirmed that using couriers was an accepted past practice. She found the rules were applied inconsistently. Some people actually were allowed to cast new ballots while these petitioners were blocked. She even found one person was allowed to vote after the polls officially closed. And crucially, the election chair, who was one of the people facing recall, had early access to the electronic vote counts.
And here it is. This is the most powerful finding of all. It wasn't random. Every single one of the 19 rejected votes came from a homeowner who had signed the petition to start the recall in the first place.
The judge then took a look at the HOA's own written rules, and these are the 5 official reasons a ballot can be thrown out. Notice what's not on this list? Anything about a no postmark or delivered by courier.
And that was really the final blow to the HOA's defense. The judge concluded that the HOA didn't even follow its own rulebook.
The reasons they gave for rejecting those 19 ballots were not supported by the very documents they were sworn to uphold.
In her final decision, Judge Vanella quoted the HOA's own mission statement that every effort will be made to count as many votes as possible. And then she delivered this powerful conclusion. This was not the case at the July 5, 2022 special election.
And this ruling came with consequences. The judge ordered the HOA to return the homeowner's $500 filing fee and, on top of that, to pay a $500 civil penalty for breaking its own rules. So what's the big takeaway here? This case, which all started with 19 ballots in a small community, is a huge reminder of why clear, fairly applied rules are the absolute bedrock of any functioning group.
And it leaves us with a final critical question. The story of High Lonesome Ranch isn't just about one election. It's about what happens when the rules of the game are changed mid-play. It forces us all to ask, when procedures are enforced for some people but not for others, who truly benefits and who is left without a voice.